Treasure Island, Part 1. The Old Buccaneer. The old sea dog at the Admiral Benbow. Quire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearing of the island, and that only because there is still treasure not yet lifted. I take my pen to write in the year of grace 17 and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the saber cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his starry pigtail failing over his shoulder of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black, broken nails, and the saber cut across one cheek, a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking around the cover and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 50 men on the dead man's chest, ho ye ho, and the bottle of rum, in the high old tottering voice that seems to have been turned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of slick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste and still looking about him at the cliffs and up our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant, situated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here, you matey," he cried to a man who trundled to the barrow, "bring up alongside and help us up my chest. I will stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up there for the watch ships off. What do you call me? You might call me Captain. Oh, I see you are at there." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commandeer, and indeed bad as his clothes were, and coarsely as he spoke. He had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or skipper accustomed to be obeyed or to strike. The man who came with the barrow told us the mail had set him down the morning before at the Royal George, that he had inquired what inns were along the coast, and hearing ours was spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, had chosen it from the others for his place of residence, and that was all he could learn of our guest. He was a very silent man by custom. All day he hung around the cove or upon the cliffs with a brass telescope. All evening he sat in the corner of the parlour next the fire and drank rum and water very strong. Mostly he would not speak when spoken to, only look up sudden and fierce and blow through his nose like a foghorn. And we and the people who came about our house soon learned to let him be. Every day when he came back from his stroll, he would ask if any seafaring man had gone by along the road. At first we thought it was the want of company of his own kind that made him ask this question, but at last we began to see he was desirous to avoid them. When a seaman did put up at the Admiral Benbow, as now and then some did, making by the coast road to Bristol, he would look in at him through the curtained door before he entered the parlour, and he was always sure to be as silent as a mouse when such was present. For me, at least, there was no secret about the matter. for I was, in a way, a sharer in his alarms. He had taken me aside one day and promised me a silver fourpenny for the first of every month if I would keep my weather eye open for a seafaring man with one leg, and let him know the moment he appeared. Often enough, when the first of the month came around, and I applied to him for my wage, he would only blow through his nose at me and stare me down. Before the week was out, he was sure to think better of it, bring me my fourpenny piece, and repeat his orders to look out for the seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams, I need scarcely tell you. On stormy nights, when the wind shook the four corners of the house, and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in a thousand forms and with a thousand diabolic expressions. Now the leg would be cut off at the knee, now at the hip. Now he was a monstrous kind of creature who had never but had but one leg, and that is in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over hedge and ditch was the worst of nightmares, and altogether I paid pretty dear for my monthly fourpenny piece in the shape of these abominable fancies. But I thought I was so terrified by the idea of the seafaring man with one leg. I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. There were nights where he took a deal more room and water than his head could carry, and then he would sometimes sit and sing his wicked old wild sea songs, minding nobody, but sometimes he would call for the glasses around and force all the trembling company to listen to his stories or bear chorus to his singing. Often I have heard the house shaking with yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, all the neighbors joining in the dear life, with the fear of death upon them, and each singing louder than the other to avoid remark. For in these fits he was most overriding companion overknown. He would slap his hand on the table for silence all around. He would fly up in the passion of anger at a question, or sometimes because none was put. And so he judged the company was not following his story. Nor would he follow anyone to leave the inn till he had drunk himself sleepy and reeled off to bed. His stories were what frightened people, worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank, and the storms at sea, and the Tortugas, and the wild deeds and places in the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men the God ever allowed upon the sea, and the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes he described. My father was always saying the inn would be ruined, for people would soon cease coming there to be tyrannized over and put down and sent shivering to their beds. But I really believe his presence did us good. People were frightened at the time, but on looking back, they rather liked it. It was a fine excitement in a quiet country life, and there was even a party of younger men who pretended to admire him, calling him a true sea dog and a real old soul, and such like names, saying there was a sort of man that made England terrible at sea. In one way, indeed, he bade fair to ruin us, for he kept on staying week after week, and at last month after month, so that all the money had been long exhausted, and still my father never plucked up the heart to insist of having more. If ever he mentioned it, the captain blew through his nose so loudly that you might say he roared, and stared my poor father out of the room. I have seen him writing, wringing his hands after such a rebuff, and I am sure the annoyance and the terror he lived in must have been greatly hastened his early and unhappy death. All the time he lived with us, the captain made no change whatsoever in his dress, but to buy some stocking over from a hawker. One of the cocks of his hat having fallen down, he left it hang that day forth, though it was a great annoyance when it blew. I remember the appearance of his coat, which he patched himself upstairs in his room, and in which before the end was nothing more but patches. He never wrote or received a letter, and he never spoke with any but the neighbors, and with these, for the most part, only when drunk on rum. The great sea chest none of us had ever seen open. It was only once crossed, and that was towards the end, when my poor father was far gone in a decline that took him off. Dr. Livesey came late one afternoon to see the patient, took a bit of dinner from my mother, and went into the parlour to smoke a pipe until his horse could come down from the hamlet, for we had no stabling at the old Benbow. I followed him in, and I remember observing the contrast, the neat, bright doctor, with his powder as white as snow, and his bright black eyes and pleasant manners, made with the coltish country folk, and above all with that filthy, heavy, bleared scarecrow of a pirate of ours, sitting far gone in rum, with his arms on the table. Suddenly he, the captain, that is, began to pipe up his eternal song, 15 men on a dead man's chest, ho, yo, and a bottle of rum. Drink the devil had gone for the rest, ho, yo, and a bottle of rum. At first I had supposed the dead man's chest to be identical big box of his upstairs in the front room, and the thought had been mingled in my nightmares with that of one-legged seafaring man. But by this time I had all long ceased to pay any particular notice to the song. It was new that night, nobody but Dr. Livesey, and on him I observed it did not produce an agreeable effect, for he looked up for a moment quite angrily before he went on with his talk to old Taylor, the gardener, on a new cure for the rheumatics. In the meantime, the captain gradually brightened up at his own music, and at last flapped his hand upon the table before him in a way we all knew to mean silence. The voices stopped at once, all but Dr. Livesey's. He went on as before, speaking clear and kind, and drawing briskly on his pipe between every word or two. The captain glared at him for a while, flapped his hand again, and glared still harder, and at last broke out with a villainous low oath. "Silence there, between decks." "Were you addressing me, sir?" said the doctor, and when the ruffian had told him with another oath that it was so, "I have only one thing to say to you, sir," replies the doctor, "that if you keep on drinking rum, the world will soon be quiet for a very dirty scoundrel." The old fellow's fury was awful. He sprang to his feet, drew and opened the sailor's clasp knife, and balancing it open on the palm of his hand, threatened to pin the doctor to the wall. The doctor never so much as moved. He spoke to him as before, over his shoulder, and in the same tone of voice, rather high, so that all the room might hear, but perfectly calm and steady. "If you do not put that knife this instant in your pocket, I promise, upon my honor, you shall hang at the next aces." Then followed a battle of looks between them, but the captain soon knocked under, put up his weapon, and resumed his seat, grumbling like a beaten dog. "And now, sir," continued the doctor, "since I now know that there's such a fellow in my district, you may count I'll have an eye upon you day and night. I am not a doctor only, I am a magistrate, and if I catch a breath of complaint against you, if it's only for a piece of incivility like tonight's, I'll take effectual means to have you hunted down and rooted out of this. Let that suffice. Soon after, Dr. Liveseyhorse came to a door and he rode away, but the captain held his peace that evening, and for many evenings to come. Black Door appears and disappears. It was not very long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us of last of the captain, though not, as you'll see, of his affairs. It was a bitter cold winter, with long hard frosts and heavy gales, and it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. He sank daily, and my mother and I had all the inn upon our hands, and were kept busy enough without paying much regret to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all grey with hoarhost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and set out down the beach, his cutlass swinging under the broad skirts of the old blue coat, his brass telescope under his arm, his hat tilted back upon his head. I remember his breath hanging like smoke in his wake as he strode off, and the last sound I heard of him as he turned the big rock was a loud snort of indignation, as though his mind was still running upon Dr. Livesey. Well, mother was upstairs with father, and I was laying the breakfast table against the captain's return, when the parlor door opened and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, towely creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and thought he wore a cutlass. He did not look much like a fighter. I had always my eye open for seafaring men, with 1 leg or 2, and I remember this one puzzled me. He was not sailory, and yet he had a smack of sea about him too. I asked him if he was what was of his service, and he said he would take a rum. But as I was going out of the room to fetch it, he sat down upon a table and motioned me to draw near. I paused where I was, with my napkin in my hand. "Come here, Sonny," said he. "Come near here." I took a step nearer. "Is this here table for my mate Bill?" he asked with a kind of leer. I told him I did not know his mate Bill, and this was for a person who stayed in our home, whom we called the captain. "Well," said he, "my mate Bill would be called the captain, as like as not. He has a cut on one cheek, and a mighty pleasant way with him, particularly in drink, has my mate Bill. Well, put it, for argument like that your captain has a cut in one cheek, and we'll put it, if you like, that the cheek is on the right one." "Oh, well," I told you. "Now, is my mate Bill in this here house?" I told him he was out walking. "Which way, Sonny? Which way is he gone?" And when I had pointed out the rock and told him how the captain was likely to return, and how soon, he answered a few other questions. "Ah," said he, "this'll be as good as a drink to my mate Bill." The expression of his face as he said these words was not at all pleasant, and I had my own reasons for thinking that the stranger was mistaken, even supposing he meant what he said. But it was no affair of mine, I thought, and besides, it was difficult to know what to do. The stranger kept hanging about just inside the inn door, peering around the corner like a cat waiting for a mouse. Once I stepped out myself into the road, But he immediately called me back, and as I did not obey quick enough for his fancy, a most horrible change came over his tall face, and he ordered me with an oath that made me jump. As soon as I was back again, he returned to his former manner, half feigned, half sneering, patted me on the shoulder, told me I was a good boy, and he had taken quite a fancy to me. "I have a son of my own," said he, "as like you as 2 blocks, and all the pride of my art. But the great thing for boys is discipline, sonny, discipline. Now, if you had saved the lumber of Bill, you wouldn't have stood there to be spoken to twice, not you. That was never Bill's way, nor the way of sick, as said with him. And here, sure enough, is my mate Bill, with a spyglass under his arm, bless his old art. To be sure, you and me will just go back into the parlor, sonny, and get behind the door, and we'll give Bill a little surprise, bless his heart, I say again." So saying, the stranger backed along with me into the parlor and put me behind him in the corner, so that we were both hidden by the open door. It was very uneasy and alarmed, as you may fancy, and it rather added to my fears to observe that the stranger was certainly frightened himself. He cleared the hilt of his cutlass, loosened the blade in the sheath, and all the time we were waiting there he kept swallowing, as he felt that we used to call a lump in the throat. At last in strode the captain, slammed the door behind him without looking to the right or left, and marched straight across the room to where his breakfast waited him. "Bill," said the stranger in his voice, and I thought that he had tried to make bold and big. The captain spun around on his heel and fronted us. All the brown had gone out of his face, and even his nose was blue. He had the look of a man who sees a ghost, or the evil one, or something worse, if anything can be, and upon my word I felt sorry to see him, all in a moment, turned so old and sick. "Come, Bill, you know me. You know an old shipmate, Bill, surely," said the stranger. The captain made a sort of gasp. "Black dog," said he. "And who else?" returned the other, getting more at ease. "Black dog as ever was. Come to see his old shipmate Billy at the Admiral Benbow Inn. Ah, Bill, we have seen a sight of times, us two, since I lost them 2 talents," holding up his mutilated hand. "Now, look here," said the captain. "You've run me down. Here I am. Well, then speak up. What is it?" "That's you, Bill," returned Black Dog. "You are in the right of it, Billy. I'll have a glass of rum from this dear child here, as I've took much a liking to, and we'll sit down, if you please, and talk square, like old shipmates." When I returned with the rum, they were already seated in either side of the captain's breakfast table, Black Dog next to the door, and sitting sideways, as to have an eye on his old shipmate, and one, as I thought, on his retreat. He bade me go and leave the door wide open. "None of your keyholes for me, sonny," he said, and I left them together and retired into the bar. For a long time, though I certainly did my best to listen, I could hear nothing but a low guttling. But at last the voices began to grow higher, and I could pick up a word or two, mostly oaths, from the captain. "No, no, 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 and an end of it," he cried again at once. "And again, if it comes to swinging, swing all, say I."